The forest floor was frozen solid, and the trees, heavy with snow, seemed to suck all sound from the world. For Private John Miller of the 101st Airborne Division, reality had shrunk to the jagged rim of his foxhole, a shallow grave scraped into the unforgiving Belgian earth. It was just before dawn on December 22nd, 1944. The cold was a physical entity, a predator that gnawed at his bones through the thin fabric of his standard-issue uniform, a uniform designed for a different war, a different season. He hadn't felt his toes in 2 days. Every breath was a painful, crystalline cloud. The world outside his frozen crater was a monochrome nightmare of white and gray, punctuated by the black, skeletal arms of the Ardennes forest. Survival had become a primal, minute-by-minute calculus. A sip of near-frozen water from his canteen, a broken piece of a K-ration bar that tasted like sawdust, the constant, desperate shifting of his weight to keep the blood flowing. He and the men huddled in nearby holes were no longer the elite, screaming eagles who had dropped from the skies over Normandy. They were ghosts, surrounded, outnumbered, and seemingly forgotten by God. The German war machine, in a final, desperate surge that would be known as the Battle of the Bulge, had encircled their position in the vital crossroads town of Bastogne. The constant rumble of enemy artillery had become the world's heartbeat, a steady rhythm of impending doom. But on this morning, the rhythm stopped. The silence that descended was more terrifying than the shelling. It was a heavy, expectant quiet that made every soldier grip his rifle a little tighter. In the absence of explosions, every snap of a frozen twig, every whisper of wind through the pines, sounded like an approaching footstep. Miller pushed his helmet back, his eyes scanning the misty tree line. He was exhausted, hungry, and haunted by the faces of friends he had already lost. For a young man from Ohio who had joined up to see the world, this frozen hell was an unimaginable end. He thought of home, of a warm kitchen and the smell of coffee, and wondered if he would ever feel warmth again. Then he saw a flicker of movement in the distance. Not the gray-green of a German patrol, nor the hulking shadow of a panzer tank. It was something impossible. 4 figures, walking slowly, deliberately, out of the morning mist. One of them held a pole, and from it hung a piece of white cloth, a truce flag. Miller blinked, rubbing his eyes, certain the cold and lack of sleep were finally making him hallucinate. But the figures kept coming, their dark greatcoats stark against the snow. A ripple of confusion and disbelief spread along the American line. Whispers turned to hushed, urgent shouts. What the hell is that? Is it a trap? For men who had been fighting for their lives against an overwhelming force, the sight of a white flag was a paradox. It spoke of negotiation, of rules, of a civilized process that had no place in this brutal, frozen landscape. To Miller, huddled in his hole, a single, dangerous thought ignited in his exhausted mind. Hope. Did this mean it was over? Could they finally lay down their weapons, get a hot meal, and simply live? The thought was so powerful, so seductive, it almost brought him to his knees. He didn't think of victory or defeat, of politics or strategy. He thought only of survival, the promise of an end to the cold, the fear, and the dying. But the message these men carried was not for Private Miller. It was not meant to address the primal fears of the men in the foxholes. It was a political document, a formal instrument of war, crafted by commanders who saw this battle not as a struggle for survival, but as a problem on a map. As the German officers were halted by American outposts, the stark difference in their worlds became clear. The Germans were clean-shaven, their uniforms immaculate, their boots polished. They represented order, logic, and a military tradition that stretched back centuries. They had come to offer what they believed was a reasonable, honorable solution to a hopeless situation. The American soldiers who met them were gaunt, their faces smudged with dirt and stubble, their eyes hollowed out by fatigue. They were the embodiment of sheer, stubborn resistance. They led the German delegation through the shattered woods, past the grim-faced paratroopers who watched them with a mixture of suspicion and raw hatred. Every step of that walk was a journey from one reality to another, from the brutal, personal struggle of the frontline soldier to the cold, detached realm of high command. Miller watched them pass, a knot of dread tightening in his stomach. The flicker of hope he had felt was now being consumed by a new uncertainty. The decision was being taken out of their hands. The delegation was brought to a hastily established command post. The door closed behind them, shutting out the wind, the snow, and the thousands of men whose fates were now being debated inside. For those waiting in the frozen silence outside, that closed door was a barrier between two worlds. Inside, men would speak of honor, of duty, of historical precedent. Outside, men like Miller simply prayed for life. The silence stretched on, thick and suffocating. The entire forest seemed to be holding its breath. A decision was about to be made. A response formulated that would determine whether this patch of frozen ground would become a footnote in history or a legend. But that decision would not be based on the logic of survival that every soldier in his foxhole understood. It would be based on a strange and unyielding philosophy, a warrior's creed that they had been taught in the screaming winds of jump school. But one they had never seen tested like this. A creed that believed being surrounded wasn't a predicament, it was an opportunity. To understand the impossible situation the 101st Airborne found itself in, you have to understand the significance of the sleepy Belgian town they were tasked to hold. Bastogne was not a fortress. It had no great strategic value in its architecture or its resources. Its power lay in something far more fundamental: its location. It was the nexus, the central hub of 7 major roads that snaked through the dense, snow-choked Ardennes forest. For Adolf Hitler's massive armored columns, these roads were arteries. Control Bastogne, and you control the flow of the entire offensive. The tanks, the fuel, the reinforcements, everything the German war machine needed to slice the Allied forces in two and drive to the sea had to pass through this town. To lose Bastogne was not just to lose a piece of ground. It was to lose the linchpin of the entire Allied front in that sector. It was, quite simply, the most important 7 square miles on the Western Front. And the men sent to hold this critical crossroads were, by any rational measure, the wrong men for the job. Not because of their spirit, but because of their circumstances. The 101st Airborne, the legendary Screaming Eagles, were still licking their wounds from the brutal fighting in Holland during Operation Market Garden. They were in Reims, France, supposedly resting and refitting, when the German offensive shattered the pre-Christmas calm. The call to arms was sudden and chaotic. They were rushed to the front with such speed that they left behind not only their proper winter equipment, but much of their heavy weaponry and, crucially, their commanding officer. Major General Maxwell Taylor was in Washington, D.C. for a staff meeting. In his place stood a man who, on the surface, seemed an odd fit for the command of these elite, swaggering paratroopers. Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe was not a charismatic infantry leader forged in the heat of close-quarters combat. He was an artilleryman, a calm, methodical, almost academic officer who saw the battlefield as a series of mathematical problems to be solved. He was shorter than most of his men, wore spectacles, and possessed a quiet, wry sense of humor. There was an unspoken question hanging in the air among the hardened veterans of the 101st. Was this quiet tactician, this artillery guy, truly capable of leading them through the storm that was about to break? He was an outsider, temporarily holding the reins of a very proud and tight-knit family. His leadership was an unproven variable in a rapidly deteriorating equation. That equation was horrifyingly simple. The 101st, along with a few attached combat commands from other divisions, numbered around 11,000 men. They were a light infantry force, designed to be dropped behind enemy lines and hold out for a few days until relieved. Now, they were standing in the path of the German 5th Panzer Army. 5 enemy divisions, including 2 of Germany's formidable panzer divisions, were converging on them. The The total enemy force was estimated at over 50,000 men, supported by hundreds of tanks and assault guns. The odds were a staggering 5-1 against them. Making matters worse, the 101st was not prepared for a siege. They had been thrown into the fight with only the ammunition they could carry. Each soldier had a standard combat load, and the artillery batteries had a terrifyingly finite number of shells. They had no winter clothing to speak of. Men were wrapping their feet in burlap sacks to ward off frostbite as temperatures plummeted far below freezing. Medical supplies were so scarce that doctors were using torn parachutes for bandages. Food was rationed to a few bites a day. And then there was the weather. A thick, persistent fog and low-lying clouds smothered the entire region. A meteorological prison that made any hope of aerial resupply or air support impossible. They were completely and utterly alone, an island of American resistance in a sea of German steel. From the German perspective, the capture of Bastogne was a foregone conclusion. General Heinrich von Luttwitz, the commander of the 47th Panzer Corps, saw the situation for what it was: a trapped, undersupplied, and outnumbered enemy. The town was surrounded. The Americans had no way out, and no help coming in. It was a simple matter of time before they were either annihilated or forced to surrender. Any commander in the German military tradition, schooled in the Clausewitzian logic of war, would look at the map and arrive at the same conclusion. The fight was already over. All that remained was the final act. But McAuliffe, the quiet artilleryman, saw something different. Where others saw a trap, he saw a unique geometric advantage. A defensive perimeter is usually a straight line, vulnerable to being broken at a single point. But a 360-degree perimeter, a circle, had different properties. His background wasn't in leading infantry charges. It was in the precise, calculated science of trajectory and firepower. He knew that his greatest weapon wasn't the number of rifles he had, but his artillery specifically, the way he could use it. He began to organize his cannons not to defend one direction, but to defend all of them. He created a fire brigade of heavy artillery that could pivot and concentrate its full fury on any point of the circle that was threatened. It was a brilliant, innovative application of classic military doctrine, a tactical masterstroke born of necessity. This was his hidden card, a plan that turned the disadvantage of being surrounded into a potent, flexible killing field. Yet, even this tactical brilliance relied on one thing they were running out of: ammunition. It was a race against time, a desperate gamble that his men could hold out long enough for his strategy to matter. The sound of German tank treads was a constant reminder, a grinding metallic groan on the horizon that grew louder each hour. For the outside world, for the strategists and politicians reading reports far from the front, the fall of Bastogne was not a question of if, but when. To comprehend what was about to happen in that small command post in Bastogne, one must look beyond the maps, the troop numbers, and the dwindling ammunition counts. The real battlefield was not in the snow-covered forests. It was in the minds of the men, shaped by two profoundly different philosophies of war. The German ultimatum was not merely a tactical maneuver. It was the logical product of one culture colliding with the unyielding creed of another. The men of the 101st Airborne were not conscripts. This simple fact is the key to understanding everything that followed. Every single soldier, from the lowest private to the highest-ranking officer, was a volunteer. They had actively chosen to be there. They had raised their hands and stepped forward, seeking out the most dangerous and demanding form of warfare imaginable. To become a paratrooper was to endure a baptism by fire at places like Fort Benning, Georgia. The training was a relentless scientific process, designed to do one thing: strip away the fundamental human instinct for self-preservation. The physical demands were immense, but the psychological conditioning was the true crucible. Instructors pushed recruits to their absolute limits, creating controlled chaos and exhaustion to see who would break. Every jump from a tower, every grueling forced march, every night spent in a simulated combat zone was a test. The system was designed to weed out not just the physically weak, but anyone who hesitated, anyone who clung too tightly to their own survival. Those who graduated were not just soldiers, they were converts. They had been indoctrinated into a new faith, the religion of the airborne. Its central tenet was absolute. A paratrooper is dropped behind enemy lines to complete a mission, and he completes it, or dies trying. Surrender was not an option. It was a heresy. It was a concept so alien to their conditioning that it simply did not compute. They were an elite brotherhood, forged in shared hardship, and their defining characteristic was a collective refusal to ever quit. This warrior culture stood in stark contrast to the man who was now demanding their surrender. General Heinrich von Lüttwitz was a product of a different world, a German aristocrat steeped in the centuries-old traditions of the Prussian military. He was a professional, not a fanatic. His worldview was governed by logic, honor, and a commander's solemn duty. To him, war was a violent but rational extension of politics. It had rules, both written and unwritten. One of those rules was that a commander had a profound moral responsibility to preserve the lives of his men. When a situation became strategically hopeless, when further resistance would only lead to the useless annihilation of brave soldiers, the honorable course of action was to offer terms of surrender. In sending his ultimatum to the American commander, von Lüttwitz was not, in his own mind, committing an act of arrogance or insult. He was performing what he considered to be the duty of a responsible officer. He was extending a professional courtesy to an opponent he believed to be honorable but doomed. He was offering a chance to avoid a pointless bloodbath, to save thousands of lives on both sides from being squandered in a fight that, according to every piece of tactical evidence, was already over. He expected his American counterpart, whom he assumed was a fellow professional, to look at the map, assess the overwhelming odds, and make the only logical choice. It was a gesture meant to be understood between gentlemen warriors, a formal acknowledgement that the game was up. He was speaking the traditional language of European warfare, a language of pragmatism and calculated necessity. And so, as the four-man German delegation waited for a response, they were not anxious. They were expectant. They were confident that the American commander, whoever he was, would understand the gravity of the situation and the honor of their offer. They were, in essence, waiting for a mirror image of themselves, a commander who would weigh the costs and benefits and choose the path that preserved his force. They had no framework, no cultural or military precedent, to understand the mindset of the men they had trapped. They failed to comprehend that they were not talking to a conventional army unit that happened to be surrounded. They were talking to the 101st Airborne. For the Screaming Eagles, the German offer was incomprehensible for the opposite reason. The idea that a commander's primary duty was to preserve life was secondary to the real objective, accomplishing the mission. They had been sent to Bastogne with a single, unambiguous order: hold the town. Everything else, their hunger, their lack of ammunition, the freezing cold, their very lives, was irrelevant detail. The mission was the only reality that mattered. To them, von Lüttwitz's offer was not an act of professional courtesy. It was a profound insult. It implied that they were weak, that they were beaten, and that their commitment was negotiable. It questioned the very foundation of their identity. This created a fundamental, unbridgeable gap in understanding. The Germans were making a logical appeal based on material conditions. The Americans were preparing to respond based on an absolute, almost spiritual, cultural commitment. It was a clash, not of armies, but of entire worldviews. One side believed that courage was knowing when to stop fighting to save your men. The other believed that courage was a refusal to ever stop, regardless of the cost. The German officers waiting in the cold believed they were about to receive a tactical decision. They were, instead, about to receive a lesson in philosophy, delivered in a way they could never have anticipated. The answer that was being formulated in General McAuliffe's command post was not coming from a military textbook. It was being dredged up from the soul of a new kind of American warrior. Inside the makeshift command post, the air was cold and stale, thick with the smell of wet wool, mud, and nervous energy. Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe had been asleep for only a short while. a brief, dreamless plunge into oblivion that was the soldier's only true escape. He was awakened by a gentle but firm shake of the shoulder. It was his operations officer, Lieutenant Colonel Harry Kinnard. In the dim lantern light, McAuliffe could see the serious expressions on the faces of his staff. There was no immediate sound of attack, no new artillery barrage. This was something different. They handed him the piece of paper. It was a formal ultimatum, typed in both German and English. McAuliffe, still shaking off the fog of sleep, sat on the edge of his cot and began to read. The language was formal, almost floridly polite. It spoke of the well-known American bravery, but lamented the useless annihilation that would follow if they continued to resist. It offered honorable surrender, promising humane treatment according to the Geneva Convention. But if the offer was rejected, it warned, the German Artillery Corps and their 6 heavy anti-aircraft battalions were prepared to annihilate the USA troops. McAuliffe read it once, then a second time. A slow smile spread across his face. In the context of their desperate situation surrounded, freezing, low on everything, the sheer pompous audacity of the German demand struck him as profoundly absurd. He looked up at his staff, who were watching him intently, their faces grim. To them, this was a death warrant or a demand for their humiliation. To McAuliffe, it was the most ridiculous thing he had ever heard. "They want to surrender to us?" he asked, a glint of wry humor in his eyes. His staff looked confused. "No, sir," they clarified. The Germans were demanding their surrender. McAuliffe scoffed, stood up, and crumpled the paper in his hand, tossing it onto the floor. "Aw, nuts," he exclaimed. The words hung in the air. It wasn't a strategic pronouncement. It wasn't a line from a military manual. It was a visceral, spontaneous, and quintessentially American expression of pure, unadulterated contempt. It was the verbal equivalent of a shrug and a middle finger. It meant, "You're crazy, that's ridiculous, and go away, all at once." In that single, crude syllable, McAuliffe had captured the entire spirit of his division's defiance. For a moment, the staff was silent. Then, a discussion began. How should they formally reply? A long, verbose rejection detailing their commitment to duty? A simple, formal no? As they debated, they kept coming back to the general's first reaction. Kinnard, his operations officer, spoke up. "That first remark of yours would be hard to beat, General." An idea began to take shape. What if that wasn't just a reaction? What if that was the answer? The sheer, audacious brilliance of it was undeniable. A formal reply would grant the German ultimatum a dignity it didn't deserve. It would engage them in their own game of protocol and military tradition. But nuts! It was a rejection not just of the demand, but of the entire mindset behind it. It was a slap in the face. It communicated, with perfect, ungrammatical clarity, that the 101st Airborne did not operate on the same plane of reality as their enemies. They were not playing by the same rules. The decision was made. A clerk was summoned, and a small, plain piece of paper was inserted into a typewriter. The official reply was composed. It read, "To the German commander, nuts, the American commander." There was no rank, no formality, no explanation, just the word, standing alone, a monument to their collective defiance. The note was handed to Colonel Joseph Harper, the commander of the 327th Glider Infantry Regiment, who was tasked with delivering it to the waiting German delegation. Harper met the 4 German officers at the American outpost. They had been waiting in the freezing cold, their posture stiff and expectant. Major Wagner, the German intelligence officer, stepped forward. "Have you brought the American commander's reply?" he asked formally. "I have," Harper said, holding out the small, folded piece of paper. The major took it, unfolded it, and stared at the single word typed in the center. A look of complete and utter bewilderment crossed his face. He passed it to the officer next to him. They all read it, their expressions a mixture of confusion and disbelief. This was not a response they had been trained to understand. It fit nowhere in their manuals of war. Finally, Major Wagner looked back at Harper, his professionalism overriding his confusion. "Is this a negative or an affirmative reply?" he asked. "What does this mean?" Harper, enjoying the moment, allowed himself a small, cold smile. "The reply is decidedly not affirmative," he said. He then explained, with deliberate, forceful simplicity, exactly what the message conveyed. In plain English, it means the same as, "Go to hell." The translation hit the German officers like a physical blow. The mask of professional decorum vanished, replaced by flushed cheeks and furious indignation. They had offered an honorable, traditional way out. They had behaved like gentlemen, and in return, they had been met with a crude, barbaric insult from these arrogant Americans. There was nothing more to say. They snapped a stiff, furious salute, turned on their heels, and marched back toward their lines, their backs rigid with anger. The message had been delivered. The cultural chasm had been bridged by an insult. For McAuliffe and his men, it was a moment of morale-boosting victory, a joke shared in the face of annihilation. But they all knew what would come next. The time for words, polite or otherwise, was over. The Germans' professional pride had been wounded. Their sense of order had been offended. And now, their fury would be unleashed. A single word had just lit the fuse on one of the most concentrated and brutal assaults of the battle. The question now was a simple one. Could the spirit behind that one word possibly stand against the storm of steel that was about to rain down upon them? The German response was not tactical. It was volcanic. The insult of nuts had bypassed the rational military minds of the German command and struck a raw, nationalistic nerve. The fury was immediate and indiscriminate. Within an hour, the entire perimeter of Bastogne erupted in a storm of fire and steel. It felt as if every cannon, mortar, and rocket launcher on the Western Front had been aimed at this one small town. The pre-dawn sky ripped open, bleeding strobing flashes of orange and white. The serene, snow-covered landscape of the Ardennes was transformed into a churning cauldron of explosions. For Private John Miller, the world ceased to exist beyond the shaking walls of his foxhole. The ground bucked and heaved like a living thing in its death throes. The air became a solid wall of noise, the deafening concussive crump of artillery shells, the high-pitched demonic scream of incoming rockets, and the constant, terrifying hiss of shrapnel slicing through the frozen air. He curled into the fetal position, pressing himself into the icy mud, his helmet digging into his neck. There was no strategy here, no courage, only the primal, animal instinct to make himself as small as possible, to somehow survive the universe's attempt to erase him from existence. He could smell the acrid cordite, the stench of churned earth, and something else, the metallic, coppery scent of blood. The screams of wounded men were swallowed by the cacophony, brief and terrible punctuations in the symphony of destruction. This was the German plan: to pulverize the Americans into submission, to make them pay for their arrogance with blood and terror. They launched coordinated infantry and armor assaults from multiple directions, probing for a weak point, certain that under this apocalyptic barrage, the American line would crack. A column of Panzer IVs and grenadiers attacked from the north, near the village of Noville. Simultaneously, another powerful thrust hit the western flank, aiming to sever the line completely. It was the classic hammer and anvil, designed to shatter the encircled force. But the Germans were not fighting a static line. They were attacking a wasp's nest. And now, General McAuliffe's hidden card, his artilleryman's masterpiece, was played. In the American command post, the atmosphere was not one of panic, but of intense, focused calculation. As reports of the attacks crackled over the field radios, McAuliffe and his staff began to conduct their orchestra of death. They had divided the 360-degree perimeter like the face of a clock. The attack from the north was at 12 o'clock. The thrust from the west was at 9 o'clock. Instead of having his artillery batteries locked into defending only their own sector, McAuliffe had organized them into mobile fire brigades. A call would go out. Fire mission, Sector 12. From all around the circle, cannons that were not currently engaged would pivot on their bases. Artillerymen, working with desperate speed in the freezing cold, would recalculate their trajectories. Within minutes, a devastating concentration of shells from multiple directions would rain down on the head of the German column at Nouville. The panzers, expecting to face fire from only one direction, were suddenly bracketed by explosions from their front and their flanks. The infantry was shredded. The attack faltered, then broke. Then, before the Germans could regroup, the call would shift. Fire mission, Sector 9. The guns would pivot again. The same storm of high explosives would be unleashed on the western thrust. It was a brutally effective, shockingly flexible system. The handful of American artillery batteries, numbering just a few dozen guns in total, were acting with the effectiveness of a force 3 times their size. McAuliffe had turned the trap of encirclement into a weapon. He had created a 360-degree killing field where the enemy, no matter where they attacked, would find themselves walking into a perfectly aimed meat grinder. The men in the foxholes, like Miller, didn't understand the complex ballistics. All they knew was that just when it seemed they were about to be overrun, the sky would fill with the comforting sound of friendly shells whistling overhead, and the German attack would melt away in a series of earth-shattering explosions. They held their ground, their individual acts of courage fueled by the knowledge that they were not alone. But the cost was immense. Each repulsed attack left more men dead or wounded, and each shell fired from an American cannon was one less they had. The ammunition piles dwindled at an alarming rate. They were winning the battles, but they were losing the war of attrition. The weather remained their implacable enemy, the thick gray clouds a ceiling on their hopes for resupply. And then, a new sound filtered through the din of battle. It wasn't a sound of cannons or tanks, but of human voices. A rumor, passed from one frozen foxhole to the next, a whisper carried on the wind. Patton. The name was spoken with a kind of reverence. Georgie is coming. General George S. Patton and his unstoppable Third Army, they said, had done the impossible. He had disengaged from a fight in the south, turned his entire army 90 degrees, and was now driving north through the snow and the German resistance, a relentless armored spear aimed directly at Bastogne. Hope, a commodity more precious than ammunition, began to spread through the exhausted ranks. Help was on the way. But as the rumor grew, so did a quiet, unspoken question. Patton was indeed coming. But would he arrive in time to save them from annihilation? And for the proud, defiant men of the 101st, who had just told the friend, German army to go to hell, what would it even mean to be saved? Far from the frozen hell of Bastogne, in a heated command tent filled with maps and the low hum of radios, a legend was being forged in real time. General George S. Patton, Jr. was more than a man. He was a force of nature, a theatrical, profane, and brilliant commander who believed in destiny, reincarnation, and the overwhelming power of audacious action. When the crisis in the Ardennes had erupted, and other commanders were stunned into a defensive paralysis, Patton saw only opportunity. In a now famous staff meeting with Eisenhower, when asked how long it would take to get his Third Army moving north to relieve Bastogne, he had given an answer that bordered on insubordinate arrogance. I can attack with 3 divisions in 48 hours. It was an impossible boast. The Third Army was already engaged in a massive offensive of its own, facing a different enemy in a different direction. To disengage from that fight, pivot a force of over 250,000 men and tens of thousands of vehicles, 90 degrees, and then march them over 100 miles, in the worst winter weather in decades, was a logistical nightmare that would have broken a lesser commander. But Patton was not a lesser commander. Fueled by coffee, rage, and an unshakable self-belief, he willed the impossible into being. His men marched and drove relentlessly, skidding on icy roads, fighting off German counterattacks, a vast, unstoppable armored spear aimed at the heart of the siege. For the American public back home, and for the war correspondents shivering in the press camps, this was the story. It was a simple, powerful, and deeply heroic narrative. The brave, surrounded paratroopers of the 101st were the damsels in distress. The flamboyant, hard-charging Patton was the knight in shining armor riding to the rescue. Newspapers were already writing the headlines. It was a tale of American grit and deliverance, a perfect Christmas story of salvation against all odds. Patton, always keenly aware of his own legacy, was more than happy to play the part of the savior. He was not just relieving Bastogne, he was marching into history, but inside the perimeter, a different story was being lived, and a different narrative was taking hold. The men of the 101st Airborne did not see themselves as victims. They were not waiting to be rescued. They were executing a mission. They were holding the most critical piece of real estate on the Western Front against overwhelming odds, and in their minds, they were winning. The very idea of being rescued carried with it a subtle but deeply felt insult. It implied they were failing, that they were helpless. For this elite unit, born from the sky and defined by its fierce independence, that was an unacceptable notion. A quiet, professional rivalry simmered just beneath the surface. The Airborne was the new kid on the block in the U.S. Army, a revolutionary concept still proving its worth. Armor, Patton's world, was the established, powerful force of modern land warfare, to be bailed out by the tankers, however welcome the material support might be, felt like a concession, a small crack in their carefully constructed identity as the Army's most elite warriors. They respected Patton's Third Army, but they would be damned if they were going to be cast as the helpless infantrymen in Patton's grand, glorious opera. They were the heroes of their own story, not supporting characters in someone else's. On December 26th, the day after Christmas, the physical reality of Patton's advance finally pierced the German ring of steel. A reconnaissance platoon from the 4th Armored Division, led by a Sherman tank nicknamed Cobra King, cautiously pushed forward through the snowy woods. They broke through the last line of German resistance and rumbled into the American perimeter, making contact with paratroopers near the village of Assenois. The siege of Bastogne was broken. The first meeting was a moment frozen in time, captured by photographers and destined for history books. An armored officer, Lieutenant Charles Boggess, climbed out of his tank and extended a hand to a paratrooper on the ground. There were smiles, handshakes, and a palpable sense of shared relief. But underneath the celebration was a subtle awkwardness, a collision of two worlds. The tankers had arrived, expecting to find grateful, broken men on the verge of collapse. Instead, they found lean, grim-faced, and intensely proud soldiers who looked at them less like saviors and more like long-overdue reinforcements. The paratroopers were thankful for the ammunition and medical supplies that would now flow. But there was no sense of deliverance. One paratrooper famously summed up the sentiment that evening. "They rescued us? Hell, we were doing just fine. We just had them surrounded from the inside." The physical encirclement was over, but a new and far more complex battle was just beginning. The battle for the narrative. Who would own the story of Bastogne? The men who held it from within, or the man who broke the siege from without? As news spread that General Patton himself was on his way to the front, the men of the 101st braced themselves. They had defied the German army with a single word. Now, they would have to find a way to defy the heroic narrative of their own army's most celebrated general. When General George Patton's convoy of jeeps and command vehicles finally rolled into the battered town of Bastogne, he expected a hero's welcome. He envisioned scenes of grateful paratroopers cheering his arrival, a moment of triumphant vindication that would cement his legacy as the savior of the Ardennes. What he received instead was a reception as cold and brittle as the frozen mud on the streets. There were no cheers. There were no joyful reunions. Instead, he was met with a quiet, professional, and almost unnerving indifference. The meeting between Patton and McAuliffe became a quiet legend in military circles, a masterclass in psychological warfare fought not with bullets, but with etiquette. Patton, a man who physically dominated any room he entered, strode into McAuliffe's headquarters, ready to congratulate the younger general on having been rescued. But before he could launch into his prepared remarks, McAuliffe, the calm artilleryman, preempted him. He greeted Patton warmly, shook his hand, and with a slight, knowing smile, said something to the effect of, "Glad to see you, George. We've been waiting for you to get here so we can start our attack." The statement was a tactical masterstroke. In a single sentence, McAuliffe had completely reframed the narrative. He was not the rescued. He was the commander who had successfully held a defensive position and was now ready to transition to the offensive. He positioned Patton's arrival not as a climactic rescue, but as the timely arrival of necessary support for his next phase of operations. It was audacious, it was insubordinate in its subtlety, and it left Patton momentarily speechless. The men of the 101st did not need saving. They simply needed more ammunition so they could continue the fight. This attitude permeated the entire division. When journalists swarmed into Bastogne, eager for tales of desperation and last-minute salvation, they found a story they weren't prepared for. The paratroopers refused to play the part of the victim. They spoke not of their suffering, but of their duty. They didn't describe being trapped. They talked about having a target-rich environment. The official position of the 101st Airborne became an unspoken but universally understood creed. We were not rescued. We held our ground. We fulfilled our mission. Patton and the Third Army were welcome allies who helped, but the victory at Bastogne belonged to the men who had bled for it from the inside. This fierce act of narrative ownership forces us to confront the deeper, more complex questions of the battle, creating a powerful debate that echoes to this day. Was McAuliffe's defiance, epitomized by nuts, the ultimate expression of courage? Or was it a reckless gamble with the lives of his men? Let us re-examine the moral calculus from both sides. General von Lüttwitz, in offering surrender, was acting on a principle of command responsibility that valued the preservation of his soldiers' lives above a piece of ground. From his perspective, seeing your men die for a hopeless cause was the ultimate failure of leadership. He offered a path to life, believing it was the only honorable and sane option. Who can truly argue that saving thousands of lives is an ignoble goal? McAuliffe, on the other hand, operated from a different moral universe. His primary responsibility was not to his men's survival, but to the mission he had been given by his high command. The strategic importance of Bastogne was absolute. Losing it could have prolonged the war, potentially costing tens of thousands of other lives on other battlefields. For McAuliffe, the highest moral duty was to obey his orders and hold the town, regardless of the cost. The suffering of his men was a terrible but necessary price to be paid for a greater strategic victory. Was this cold, hard calculus an act of inhumanity, or was it the very essence of what it means to be a general, forced to weigh individual lives against the fate of nations? There is no easy answer. To view McAuliffe's decision as pure heroism is to ignore the horrific suffering his men endured: the frostbite, the starvation, the terror of the shelling. But to view it as reckless pride is to ignore the profound strategic victory they secured. The stand at Bastogne bogged down the entire German offensive, buying precious time for the Allies to regroup and ultimately crush the German bulge. It was a victory that undeniably shortened the war. The story of Bastogne, therefore, is not a simple tale of good versus evil or courage versus cowardice. It is a profound moral dilemma. It is a story about two different definitions of honor, two different philosophies of command, and two different answers to the most terrible question a leader can face. What is the true price of victory? The legacy of Bastogne is not just the defiant shout of nuts. It is the quiet, haunting question that hangs in its wake. What would you have done? The battle for the town was over, but the battle for its meaning, for its soul, had just begun. It became a legend, a touchstone in American military history, precisely because it refuses to give us a comfortable conclusion, forcing every generation to re-examine the thin, bloody line between duty and defiance, between sacrifice and slaughter. The battle for Bastogne ended, but the story was just beginning. In the decades that followed, the single word uttered by General McAuliffe in that freezing command post took on a life of its own. It echoed far beyond the snow-covered forests of the Ardennes, becoming more than just a famous reply. Nuts became a cultural artifact, a piece of American folklore forged in the crucible of war. It is taught to cadets at West Point not merely as a history lesson, but as a case study in leadership, morale, and the psychological power of absolute defiance. It became a shorthand, understood by generations of soldiers and civilians alike, for the uniquely American spirit of stubborn, gritty, and often cheerful refusal to accept defeat, no matter how logical or inevitable it may seem. This story endures because it resonates with the deepest chords of the American identity. It is the ultimate underdog tale. It's the story of a small, surrounded force, lacking food, medicine, and ammunition, standing against a seemingly unstoppable titan and refusing to blink. This narrative appeals to a nation that was itself born from an improbable rebellion. A nation that has always cherished the myth of the small farmer, standing up to the powerful empire. The lone sheriff, facing down the outlaw gang. The men of the 101st were outnumbered 5-1, and yet they held the line. This wasn't just a military victory. It was a validation of the belief that courage is a force multiplier, that the will to fight can be more potent than any material advantage. Furthermore, the nuts response speaks to the American value of defiant individualism. It was a rejection of the old world, aristocratic military traditions of Europe, with their formal protocols and predictable logic. It was blunt, crude, and utterly disrespectful of the established rules. In that moment, McAuliffe wasn't just a general. He was the embodiment of every American who has ever been told, "You can't do that," and replied, "Watch me." It was a declaration of independence on a tactical scale, a statement that they would fight this war on their own terms, guided by their own unbreakable creed. The story of Bastogne is not just about holding a town. It's about a group of men who, when faced with annihilation, chose to be defined not by their circumstances, but by their character. Let us return, for a final moment, to Private John Miller, huddled in the frozen earth of his foxhole. He survived. He walked out of the Ardennes, gaunt, frostbitten, and haunted by the things he had seen, but he walked out alive. In the years that followed, as he built a life back home in Ohio, raised a family, and grew old, he would hear the story of Bastogne told and retold. He would hear the academics debate strategy, the generals claim credit, and the historians analyze the geopolitical impact. He didn't understand all the nuances of command philosophy or the rivalry between generals, but he understood the silence after the shelling stopped. He understood the impossible sight of the white flag appearing through the mist. And he understood, on a level deeper than words, what happened after their commander's reply was sent. He understood the fury of the German assault that followed, and he understood the unshakable resolve of the men to his left and right, who, despite everything, did not break. He knew that he was not a victim who had been rescued. He was a soldier who had been given a mission, and together they had accomplished it. He was part of something larger than himself, a brotherhood that had looked into the abyss and refused to yield. For him, nuts wasn't a clever retort. It was a promise made by his leaders and kept by every man in a foxhole. We will not fail you. We will not surrender. We are the 101st Airborne. The story of Bastogne leaves us with a profound and unsettling legacy. It forces us to ask fundamental questions about the nature of war, leadership, and the moral calculus of command. General McAuliffe's defiant stand is now enshrined as one of the most courageous moments in military history. But was it courage? Or was it a reckless, high-stakes gamble with the lives of thousands of his men? Was General von Lüttwitz's offer of surrender an act of civilized reason, or a failure to comprehend the spirit of his opponent? What would you have done if you were the commander, surrounded with your men freezing and dying, your ammunition running low, and an honorable offer of surrender on the table that could save their lives? Would you accept, or would you hold the line, trusting in a larger strategic purpose, knowing that your defiance would cost hundreds, perhaps thousands, more lives? There is no easy answer, and in that difficult space between defiance and duty, the true meaning of history is found. Share your own perspective on this profound moral dilemma in the comments below. Every war story contains more than one truth, and every voice adds a new layer to our understanding. And if you believe that these powerful stories of choice, courage, and the complexities of the human spirit need to be told, then press the subscribe button and join our community. Together, we will continue to explore the forgotten chapters of history, not just to remember the past, but to understand ourselves.